The first 40 years of Pakistan's history, economic history, when Pakistan was one of the fastest growing developing countries with an average growth of 40 years of 6%, as compared to the next 35 years from 1990 to 2022, when it has gone down to less than 4%. While our competitors like India have gone from 3.5% growth rate 40 years to 7%, and Bangladesh, which was almost considered a basket case by Henry Kissinger at the time of 1971, is now growing at 6 to 7% consistently. So what went wrong between these two periods? And I took the opportunity of the accessing Library of Congress to figure out what the literature about Pakistan depicts. And there were 4 or 5 hypotheses. One was the garrison state hypothesis, that this has been dominated by the military, and because the military has been one of the major beneficiaries of the economic development, therefore the country didn't do so well from 1990 onwards, when its interventions were not direct but indirect. Now I look at the data and I found that the peak of the defense expenditure was in 1980, which was 6%, and it was from 1950 onwards, and particularly after 65 war, the defense expenditure had gone up. And now, over 1990 to 2022, it is now below 3%. So that cannot explain the crowding out effect, and the share of the defense expenditure in the total current expenditure of Pakistan is now 17% compared to almost 50% previously. The second hypothesis was that all the years of growth were dependent on aid flows, so 60s, 80s, 2000 to 2007. And I compared the 1960s flows, because there was data available, with 1970s, and I found that the annual flows in the 1970s were much higher than the 1960s. Although the composition had changed, it was not the Western countries, but it was the OPEC countries and the Islamic countries which came to help Pakistan particularly after the oil shock. Then I compared 1980s, when people say that because of the Afghanistan war, we took a lot of money from the US, and compared with 1990s. In 1990s, despite the fact that the US was not the major funder of Pakistan, Japan had overtaken and was the largest single bilateral, and the World Bank and other institutions continued, and the balance of payment was financed by the resident and non-resident deposits of $11 billion. And that flows, if you take them, normalize them, that also is lower than 1980s. And 2000, 2007, against the Afghan war, you have flows coming back to Pakistan, but the Kerry-Lugar bill, which came from 2009 to 2014, had much higher appropriation and disbursements compared to what happened in 1980. So this hypothesis was also empirically not validated. The third one was the fact that, international economic environment was not very conducive in the 35 years. The facts are that the developing countries have actually had the fastest growth during the 1990 to 2020, and the share of the developing countries in the global trade was much higher, growth rate was much higher than that of the advanced countries. And it was the same time India was able to increase its share from 0.5% of the world exports to 1.5%, and Bangladesh from 0.1% to 0.4%, and ours declined from 0.2% to 0.1%. So the international environment also does not explain this particular phenomenon. So what does it explain? A new insight has been provided by a very rich literature on institutional economics, which looks at how the institutions of governance actually deliver the basic goods and services, how they help in the rise of productivity, how they affect the distribution of income so you can have an inclusive growth rate. And the contrast between the institutions which made Pakistan so strong despite 4 shocks, settlement of 8 million refugees in a country which didn't have a single penny in the coffers because Reserve Bank of India did not release Pakistan's share at the time of partition. And if you look at the balance sheet of the State Bank of Pakistan today, we still consider that receivables, which we haven't received so far. And our civil servants were paid by Habibs and Adamjis. They didn't have the money. Second shock, 1965 war. Third shock, the separation of East Pakistan, 1974. Fourth shock, the nationalization of industries, universities, colleges, and insurance and banking. Fifth shock, the Afghan war. Despite these 5 shocks, Pakistan had very strong institutions. And I will give you just 4, and I would say the Planning Commission was one of the strongest institutions at that time. And I leave it to you to judge the performance of the first 40 years of Planning Commission, starting from Mr. Ishrat Hussain, who was the first deputy chairman who wrote the first 5-year plan, till today. I won't comment on that, but I leave it to your judgment as to what has happened to the quality and the strength of the Planning Commission. Second was the PIDC. Pakistan didn't have any big industrial houses. It didn't have any industry worth its name except one cement factory and few carriage factories and cotton ginning factories. By 1969, and this is not my saying, but the Development Policy Review of the World Bank said in 1969, Pakistan's manufactured exports were higher than those of Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. That was the PIDC, which established the industries, but said that the government is not in the business of running businesses. The private sector was short of capital, so PICIC and IDBP financed these companies, these enterprises, and they were then transferred to the private sector, which managed them quite well and made them competitive for exports. Third, Agriculture Development Corporation. We were unable to meet the food needs of 30 million Pakistanis at 1950. 3 million tons of wheat was produced. Then we had the Mexipac seed for wheat, the IRI for rice, the fertilizers. They were all managed and distributed by Agriculture Development Corporation. I was an assistant commissioner in a subdivision, and we got the target that so much land has to be shifted from the traditional varieties to the new varieties. How much fertilizer will be allocated to your subdivision? Up to the tehsil level they were targeting, and that was the work of the Agriculture Development Corporation. The third was WAPDA. Pakistan lost Ravi and Beas, and we were short of water. They undertook the Indus Basin Works program, and all the link canals, barrages, and the 2 dams were all constructed by WAPDA. The entire engineering staff of WAPDA, who supervised the Indus Basin Works, headed by Mr. Salar Kirmani, were en bloc recruited by the World Bank and sent all over the world, saying that if you want to learn irrigation, these are the people who will teach you irrigation. Since 1972, we never had one single reservoir. And finally, I'll give you the example of PIA. PIA was the only airline which was doing transatlantic and had, flights to all over the world. And this was the airline which established the Singapore Airlines, the Jordanian Royal Airlines, and later on the Emirates Airlines. Last time, I was asked to restructure the PIA, and the cumulative liabilities of PIA today are 450 billion rupees. So you can contrast where is PIDC. They have an ugly looking building which they can't even whitewash that, and it looks so hideous. ADC is no longer existent. WAPDA has just woken up and started some reservoirs, and the PIA is where it is. And this Planning Commission, which was actually the supplier of most of the people to the World Bank and IMF, stands where it is today. So I'll close my remarks because I'm now conscious that I have exceeded my time. But I leave this thought to you that institutions of governance do matter. And if you go behind any crisis, whether it is disaster management, whether it is the delivery of education, whether it is the health service, or the irrigation canal thefts and shortages and inefficiencies in any government department, these can all be attributed to the decay of the institutions. Thank you very much.